May 8th, 2026. Someone was in their room, phone in their hand. The screen was the brightest thing in the dark around them. And a headline arrived. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it lands. The Pentagon had released 162 files, videos, photos, military reports from many years. Cases they described in their own language as unresolved. The portal crashed. 340 million people tried to access it in the first 12 hours. The servers weren't ready. Neither were we. The files were out. Real. Available. The kind of thing that, for decades, people had been asking for. And within hours, something interesting happened. The same thing that always happens when this question gets close enough to touch. Scientists looked at the files and said, ambiguous, not enough to say anything for sure. Believers looked at the same files and said, finally, this is what we've been waiting for. Skeptics looked at the same files and said, nothing here, recycled noise. Everyone looked at the same 162 files. Nobody changed their mind. Not one person. The files aren't the problem. What we do with them is? You saw the headline too. Maybe you were in a similar room. Maybe your phone lit up and something shifted. Slightly. Briefly. Not panic. Not certainty. Something quieter than both. Like a question that opened for a second, and then didn't quite close. And then you went back to work, to dinner, to whatever was next. That feeling, that small, unfinished thing, that's actually where this episode starts. And if someone you know has been carrying the same feeling and can't explain why the story seemed bigger than it looked, you'll have something to offer them by the end of this. Because here's the most interesting part of the whole story. This wasn't new. The Pursue files were new. The server crash was new. But the reaction, the immediate split, the certainty on both sides, the minds that looked at the same evidence and arrived at completely different conclusions, that pattern is older than this story. Much older. It shows up every time this question gets close. So the interesting thing isn't the files. The interesting thing is that we've had the same reaction every single time, to every piece of evidence, across decades. What does that tell us? Not about aliens, about us. Because if the problem isn't the evidence, and it clearly isn't because evidence keeps arriving and the split never changes, then something else is doing the work. Something underneath the belief and underneath the doubt and underneath the headline. That's the question this episode is actually about. Not, are they real? But why does it matter so much, either way, that we can look at the exact same thing at the exact same moment and come away with completely different worlds? That question is what the files couldn't answer, and it might be more interesting than anything in them. So, if the problem isn't the evidence, what is it? Because we update beliefs all the time. Someone publishes a new study on sleep and something shifts. A data point arrives about interest rates and we adjust our thinking. New information about a city we thought we knew and the picture changes. We're not rigid creatures. We change our minds constantly. About diets, about routes home,
about people we thought we understood completely. We do this without much struggle. So why doesn't this work the same way? Here's the first layer.
What the evidence is asking you to accept isn't just a fact, it's a cost. And the cost is paid by everything else you already believe. Think of your understanding of the world the way you'd think of a building. Not a finished building, a living one. Some walls are load-bearing. They hold everything else up. Your sense of how society works, what gives your daily life its shape, what the rules you follow are actually connected to. These walls don't look important from the outside, but they're the ones holding the rest of the structure in place.
And when a new idea arrives that contradicts something load-bearing, the mind doesn't slow down, weigh both sides, and calmly pick the winner. It protects the one that's already holding something up, quickly, before you've even finished thinking about it. The question stops being, is this true? It becomes, what falls if I say yes?
And here's where it gets either very interesting or slightly irritating, depending on how much you enjoy being told you're part of the problem. Because here's the second layer, and this one is the part that's genuinely uncomfortable. The more capable you are of building careful arguments, the more tools you have to protect the belief that serves your identity. Not less, more. You heard that right. The people who are best at spotting patterns, constructing logic, finding the flaw in someone else's reasoning, those are also the people best equipped to find a reason to dismiss what threatens them. Your intelligence isn't failing, it's succeeding at the wrong job.
The people most likely to look at the Pursue files and arrive at a sophisticated, well-reasoned conclusion were also the people most likely to arrive at completely opposite conclusions, depending on which conclusion their sense of who they are actually needed. That's not weakness. That's a very sharp instrument, pointed in the wrong direction. You don't reject the idea of aliens because you don't believe. You reject it because of what believing would cost. And then there's a third layer, the deepest one. The alien question doesn't just ask, is this fact true? It asks something underneath the question itself, something much older. It asks, is the story you're living inside, the one that tells you your life has meaning, that your society makes sense, that the rules you follow connect to something real, is that story built on solid ground? That is not an intellectual question anymore. Something older than thought answers it first. Before the reasoning starts, before you've even decided how you feel about the evidence. The part of you that was built to protect the structure, not just the belief, but everything the belief is holding up. That part moves first. It moves the way a hand reaches for a wall in the dark. Not thinking, just protecting.
So the problem isn't that you're irrational. The problem is that you're rational in the service of something that predates reason. Which means this is not a flaw, not a failure of education or open-mindedness or intelligence. It's how humans survive an encounter with a genuinely worldview-level idea. The three-layer system, the cost calculation, the identity protection, the something deeper than thought defense, wasn't built wrong. It kept societies intact through every previous moment where the ground under everything seemed to shift.
Every time a new idea arrived that asked people to rethink not just what they knew, but who they were. The resistance isn't weakness. It's armor. And armor doesn't know the war is over.
So, we know why the resistance happens. We know about the cost calculation, the identity protection, the thing older than thought that moves first. But here's what's interesting. Even if none of that were true, even if you accepted it fully right now, with no resistance at all, you would still run into a different kind of problem. Not inside you, around you. In the systems everyone lives inside every day without noticing them. Because those systems weren't built for this question either. Start with law. Not because it's the most dramatic place to look, because it's the most concrete. The words actually exist. You can read them, and the gap in them is measurable. In 1967, 118 countries agreed on something called the Outer Space Treaty, and for what it was designed to do, it was elegant, simple. No nation can claim the moon. No government can plant a flag on a planet and call it its own. Outer space belongs to everyone, meaning every human nation, equally. A clean solution to a real problem. Humans competing with other humans for territory they hadn't reached yet. Then ask a slightly different question. What happens if a non-human intelligence already has presence on the moon? On an asteroid in the belt? What is the legal status of a prior claim that no human government ever made? The treaty has no answer. Not because the people who wrote it were careless. They weren't being careless. The question genuinely hadn't occurred to anyone. The entire legal architecture of space was built on one unspoken assumption: that the only parties who matter are human governments. Not stated, not argued, just the water the whole treaty swims in. And here's where it gets more interesting, because the law has already stretched before. It has already reached beyond individual humans to cover things that don't speak. New Zealand granted a river legal personhood. The Wanganui, a river that Maori communities had treated as a living ancestor for centuries, became, in 2017, a legal person. It can be represented in court. Colombia did something similar with the Amazon. And every time the law stretched, it did exactly the same thing. It appointed a human guardian, someone who speaks on behalf of the river, because the river cannot show up to its own negotiation. An alien civilization might. Every law ever written assumes the only intelligent claimant is human. There is no legal category for anyone else. The United Nations has 193 member states. Every seat in that building represents a human government. There is no mechanism, no procedure, no category, no vote structure for a non-human intelligent entity. No protocol, even for how to begin that question. There is, however, a committee for almost everything else. There are scientists who have thought about this seriously. The International Academy of Astronautics has a post-detection protocol, updated as recently as 2025. It says, notify the relevant authorities. Do not respond without international consultation. It is voluntary. There is no enforcement mechanism, and it does not specify who exactly speaks for Earth. The preparation is real, and the preparation confirms the gap more than it closes it. None of this is a criticism of the people who wrote those documents.
They were writing for the world they knew. A world where the only intelligent voices at any table were human ones. They were right for that shape. The question is quieter than that. What happens when the shape changes?
And law is just the first layer. Because underneath it, built on the same unspoken assumption, running on the same foundation, there are other systems. Ones that shape not just what is permitted, but what feels possible. Start with money. The space economy is projected to reach $1.8 trillion by 2035. Every dollar of that number is built on one quiet premise: that the resources being claimed were unclaimed, that the territory being developed was empty, that no prior arrangement existed, that humans hadn't made.
There is a United States law that gives Americans the right to own resources extracted from asteroids. The language it uses, abiotic resource in situ in outer space, means a resource that no one is currently using. That phrase was written by humans for a universe they had already decided, without quite deciding it, was theirs. The legal language is careful and specific. It just forgot to ask one question. What if it wasn't? What if no one is currently using was never checked? Because checking it never seemed necessary.
That is not a small thing to adjust. Now, here's the one that's harder to hold. For the first time in all of human history, all the wars, all the borders, all the flags, there would be a them that makes every version of us the same thing. The astronauts who have seen Earth from space describe something that happens consistently. The borders disappear. The planet looks like one object. The categories that organize everything down here simply don't appear from up there. After the Second World War, humanity attempted this reframe on the ground. The idea of a common humanity became real enough to write into law, but it remained, at its edges, an aspiration, something people had to be reminded of. Alien contact would do it completely, not as an aspiration, as a fact. Every line ever drawn between us and them, suddenly inside the same team, against something larger. That might be the most radical thing. Not the technology, not the panic, the realization that tribalism had a ceiling. And then the quieter one, the one that doesn't announce itself. Every civilization has defined progress the same way, expanding into territory that wasn't claimed yet. Oceans, continents, now space. The direction of forward has always pointed outward, toward what wasn't yet occupied. But not claimed yet is a phrase written from one point of view. The point of view that assumed, quietly and completely, that no one else had a point of view.
If we aren't the most advanced form of intelligence in the universe, which we have always assumed, not loudly, not proudly, but foundationally, the way you assume the floor will hold. What is the definition of forward? We had a very clear plan. It assumed a lot.
The question doesn't collapse anything. It just asks you to look at what the plan was built on.
Everything we just named, law, economy, nationhood, progress, these aren't new. They aren't the first systems built on a center that turned out to be wrong. Freud noticed a pattern. He called them narcissistic injuries, moments in history when something we believed about ourselves turned out to be incorrect. Not just factually, incorrect in a way that hurt.
The first, Copernicus. We assumed the Earth was the center of the universe. It isn't. We orbit the sun. The sun orbits a galaxy that doesn't know we exist. The second, Darwin. We assumed we were separate from animals. Evolution said no. We are animals, connected to them, descended from them, made of the same materials.
The third was Freud's own. We assumed we were masters of our own thinking. The unconscious said otherwise. You are not, he said, making the decisions you think you're making. And the fourth, quieter, but just as large, was Hubble. We assumed the Milky Way was the universe. It's one galaxy among hundreds of billions. Each time, the first response was resistance. Something in us pushed back before we could even examine the evidence. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's the same pattern we've been watching all along. But here's what happened after. Every time we were told we weren't the center, we built a new story.
After Copernicus, not the physical center, but the moral center. After Darwin, we evolved. But we're the only ones with language, with art, with the ability to ask why. After Freud, the unconscious governs us. But we're the only beings who can question that. We are very, very good at this. We've been told we're not the center before. Every time, the first answer was no. And every time, eventually, we built a new story. Now here's where it gets less comfortable. There was a philosopher named Hannah Arendt who spent her life thinking about what it means to be human. She called one of her central ideas plurality, the condition that human beings are many and distinct, yet share a world. That this difference is what makes speech and action mean anything at all. Her entire way of thinking was built for a human we. Not because she was arrogant, because the world she knew had humans in it. No one asked otherwise.
Alien confirmation doesn't just add to that way of thinking. It asks whether plurality is a human condition, or a condition of any self-aware being. Whether the we she was describing was ever as complete as she thought. Arendt never asked that question. Nobody has, in her terms. That gap is not a failure. It's the exact shape of the assumption.
In 1960, a NASA-commissioned study observed something that has stayed quietly in the record ever since. Societies sure of their place in the universe are the ones that fall apart when confronted with evidence that says otherwise. Not uncertain societies, certain ones. The word is sure. The study wasn't recommending anything. It was observing a pattern. What happens to groups when the story they built their lives inside no longer fits?
The ones who survived were the ones who changed, not the ones who resisted change successfully. The problem was never the evidence. The problem was the certainty. And certainty that was never checked is a different thing from certainty that was earned. Understanding the pattern doesn't make it easier, but it makes it more honest. We've rebuilt before. The traditions that survived previous encounters with radical otherness did so by changing, not by holding the original story perfectly intact.
We keep asking the same question. How would we adapt? How would we rebuild? What would we do with an assumption that no longer holds? But there are traditions that never had to ask that question because they never made the assumption in the first place. Buddhist cosmology describes 31 realms of conscious beings. Humans occupy one of them, not the highest. Above the human realm are beings of great comfort and beauty, gods in some translations, who exist so far from difficulty, so removed from uncertainty, that they have stopped asking why. They are too comfortable to wonder.
The human realm is considered fortunate, not because humans are the pinnacle of anything, but because the human condition contains exactly the right amount of difficulty. Enough uncertainty to keep the question alive, enough suffering to make the inquiry matter. The gods above us have lost the impulse. The beings below us haven't found it yet. Humans sit in the place where wondering is still possible and still urgent. In this framework, alien confirmation would not be a crisis. It would simply be, of course. What realm are they in? What is their relationship to suffering and liberation? The question, are we alone, was never the right question to begin with. The cosmos was always full.
The Lakota tradition describes the cosmos as organized around relationship, not hierarchy. Some indigenous theologians describe humans as the weakest of all created beings, not the crown of creation, but a participant, already in conversation with intelligences larger than themselves. The question, are we alone, does not register the same way in a cosmology that never assumed the answer was yes. These weren't frameworks that adapted to a decentering. They were frameworks that started centered differently. What you build depends on what you begin with.
You already wondered about this before today. You looked up at some point and thought, we can't be the only ones. And part of you wasn't surprised.
That feeling, that part of you, might be the most honest response to all of it. Not certainty, not panic, just the quiet acknowledgement that the question was always bigger than the answer we were given. Not the legal system, not the economic system, maybe just how we thought of ourselves as participants in something, not the point of it, a participant in it. What would we build differently if we'd always known we weren't alone?